examine it without emotion clouding your judgment, a pattern begins to reveal itself. The situations that hurt you the most are usually connected to areas where you lacked awareness, discipline, or boundaries. That's not a coincidence. That's structure. Pain follows gaps. Think about how often people walk into situations already ignoring what they know deep down. Someone stays in a relationship where respect is inconsistent, communication is weak, and effort is one-sided. The signs are there early, but they get dismissed because emotions are strong, or because the idea of being alone feels worse than tolerating the situation. Over time, the same patterns repeat: disappointment, arguments, emotional distance, and eventually it ends in a way that feels painful and abrupt. But if you trace it back, the ending wasn't sudden. It was built slowly through a series of small decisions to ignore reality. The pain at the end is not random. It is the accumulated result of those decisions. The same logic applies to work, money, and personal growth. A person avoids learning new skills because it feels uncomfortable or unnecessary at the time. They stick to what they already know, relying on stability instead of improvement. Months or years later, when opportunities require more than what they can offer, they feel stuck or left behind. Again, it feels like bad luck, but the cause is clear. Avoiding discomfort in the short term creates larger problems in the long term. Pain steps in to correct what discipline could have handled earlier. This is where most people get it wrong. They treat pain as an enemy instead of information. They react emotionally instead of analyzing it logically. When something goes wrong, the first instinct is to blame external factors, other people, timing, circumstances, and sometimes those factors are real. But even then, your response to them is what shapes the outcome. Two people can go through the same situation and end up in completely different places, not because one was luckier, but because one chose to learn while the other chose to complain. Pain forces attention. It highlights what you've been neglecting. If you've been careless with your time, pain shows up as missed opportunities. If you've been careless with your choices, pain shows up as consequences. If you've been careless with your standards, pain shows up through the people you allow into your life. It doesn't need to explain itself loudly. The message is already in the experience. There's also a level of honesty that pain demands, and that's what makes it uncomfortable. It strips away the stories you tell yourself. You can't pretend everything is fine when the results clearly show otherwise. You can't claim discipline when your actions show inconsistency. You can't expect respect when you haven't established boundaries. Pain removes the gap between perception and reality. It forces you to see things as they are, not as you want them to be. And once you see clearly, you're left with a choice. You can either adjust your behavior or repeat the same cycle. This is where growth actually happens, not in the moment of pain itself, but in the decisions that follow it. If you take the time to understand what went wrong, you start making different choices. You become more selective with your time, more aware of your habits, more intentional with your actions. Over time, those small adjustments compound into a different outcome. Real-life examples make this even clearer. Someone who goes through financial stress learns quickly the importance of budgeting, saving, and avoiding unnecessary risk. If they apply those lessons, their future becomes more stable. If they ignore them, the same stress returns, often worse than before. Someone who experiences betrayal may develop stronger boundaries and a better understanding of trust, or they may become bitter and closed off, repeating the same patterns with different people. The event is the same, but the interpretation and response determine the result. There's also a timing element to all of this. Pain often comes after a period of avoidance. It builds quietly while you delay action. You skip one responsibility, then another. You ignore one red flag, then another. Nothing happens immediately, so it feels like your choices don't matter. But eventually, the accumulation reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. That's when the consequences become visible. And because they appear suddenly, they feel overwhelming. But in reality, they've been forming for a long time. Understanding this changes how you approach life. You stop waiting for things to go wrong before taking responsibility. You start paying attention to small details early when they're easier to manage. You don't need pain to teach you the same lesson twice. That's where discipline begins to replace reaction. Instead of being forced to change, you choose to change before it becomes necessary. There's also a certain level of control that comes with this awareness. Not control over everything that happens, but control over how prepared you are for it. You can't stop unexpected situations from occurring, but you can reduce the impact they have on you. When your habits are strong, your thinking is clear, and your standards are high, you handle pressure differently. You don't panic as easily. You don't make impulsive decisions. You respond with intention instead of emotion. Pain, in this sense, becomes less frequent and less intense, not because life becomes easier, but because you become more capable. You start solving problems earlier, before they grow. You recognize patterns faster, before they repeat. You understand consequences better, before they arrive. That's the real shift. Not avoiding pain entirely, but reducing its role in your life by increasing your awareness and responsibility. When you look back at your own experiences, you'll notice this pattern everywhere. The moments that changed you the most were not comfortable. They were situations where something forced you to confront reality. And even though you may not have wanted those experiences at the time, they shaped how you think, how you decide, and how you move forward. So instead of asking why something happened, it becomes more useful to ask what it revealed, because that's where the value is. Pain doesn't just show up to hurt you. It shows up to correct you, to guide you, and to prepare you for a level of life that requires more awareness than you had before. Surviving something difficult creates a sense of relief that can easily be misunderstood as success. When the pressure lifts, when the immediate problem is gone, when you finally feel like you can breathe again, it's natural to think you've made it. But that feeling is temporary, and if you're not careful, it becomes misleading. Because getting through something is not the same as building something. It only means you avoided collapse. It doesn't guarantee progress. There's a quiet difference between people who simply survive and those who actually move forward. At first glance, they can look the same. Both went through hardship. Both faced pressure. Both made it out. But if you observe what happens next, the gap becomes obvious. One person treats survival as an endpoint, something to recover from, something to forget. The other treats it as a starting point, something to learn from, something to build on. That difference in mindset changes everything that follows. Think about someone who goes through financial difficulty. They struggle to pay bills, they cut back on expenses, they find ways to get through each month. Eventually, things stabilize. Income improves, the immediate stress fades, and life feels manageable again. At that moment, they have two options. They can return to old habit spending without thinking, avoiding long-term planning, assuming stability will last. Or they can recognize what the situation taught them and adjust their behavior, saving consistently, managing risk, building a buffer for the future. The outcome of those choices becomes visible over time. One path leads back to the same stress, often worse. The other leads to stability and growth. The same pattern shows up in relationships. Someone experiences a difficult breakup. It forces them to face loneliness, confusion, and emotional discomfort. Eventually, they heal enough to function normally again. But survival alone doesn't fix the underlying patterns. If they don't take the time to understand what went wrong, what they tolerated, what they ignored, how they contributed, they carry those habits into the next relationship. And the result is predictable. Different person, same outcome. On the other hand, if they use that experience to develop better boundaries, clearer communication, and higher standards, their future relationships improve. Not because they got lucky, but because they changed. Survival gives you distance from the problem, but it doesn't automatically give you wisdom. That requires deliberate effort. It requires reflection, honesty, and sometimes uncomfortable self-assessment. You have to look at your own decisions without defensiveness. You have to admit where you were careless, where you avoided responsibility, where you chose comfort over growth. Most people resist this step because it challenges their self-image. It's easier to blame circumstances than to examine behavior. But without that level of honesty, survival becomes temporary relief instead of lasting progress. There's also a tendency to underestimate how quickly old patterns can return. When things are difficult, you're forced to be careful. You pay attention, you think before you act. But as soon as the pressure is gone, discipline often fades. You start making exceptions, then excuses, then eventually the same choices that led to the problem in the first place. This is why many people find themselves repeating the same cycles, not because they didn't survive, but because they didn't change. Real progress comes from understanding cause and effect. Every situation you go through has a structure behind it. There are decisions that led to it, behaviors that sustained it, and consequences that followed. If you don't take the time to break that structure down, you're operating without clarity. And without clarity, your future decisions are based on guesswork rather than understanding. Consider someone who struggles with time management. They miss deadlines, feel overwhelmed, and constantly react instead of plan. At some point, the pressure becomes too much, and they're forced to adjust, temporarily working longer hours, cutting distractions, focusing intensely just to get through. Eventually, the situation improves. But if they don't build systems like scheduling, prioritization, and consistent routines, they fall back into the same pattern. Survival helped them cope, but it didn't solve the root problem. Only intentional change does that. There's also a deeper level to this idea. Survival tests your limits, but it doesn't define your standards. You can endure a lot and still accept less than you're capable of. Just because you handled a difficult situation doesn't mean you're operating at your full potential. It just means you adapted enough to get through it. Growth requires raising your standards after the fact. It requires asking yourself not just how you survive, but how you could have handled things better, more efficiently, more intelligently. This is where awareness turns into action. Once you see the patterns clearly, you have to apply that understanding consistently. Not just when things are hard, but especially when they're easy. Because easy periods are where habits are formed. If you wait for pressure to force discipline, you're always reacting. But if you build discipline when there's no urgency, you're preparing for the next challenge before it arrives. There's also a level of responsibility that comes with survival. You've seen what happens when things go wrong. You've experienced the consequences of certain choices. That knowledge puts you in a different position than someone who hasn't gone through it. Ignoring that knowledge is a form of negligence. It's choosing to repeat mistakes you already understand, and over time, that becomes harder to justify, even to yourself. People often look for motivation to move forward, but what they actually need is clarity and structure. Motivation is temporary. It comes and goes based on how you feel, but clarity stays. Once you understand why something happened and what needs to change, the next steps become more straightforward. They may not be easy, but they're clear. And that clarity reduces hesitation, reduces confusion, and increases consistency. Over time, this approach creates a different kind of confidence. Not the kind that comes from avoiding problems, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle them and learn from them. You stop fearing difficulty because you see it as part of the process, not as an interruption. You stop relying on luck because you trust your ability to adapt and improve. And most importantly, you stop repeating the same cycles because you've taken the time to understand and change them. Survival in this sense is valuable but incomplete. It gives you a chance to reset, to step back, to reassess. But what you do with that chance determines everything that follows. If you treat it as an ending, you stay where you are. If you treat it as a beginning, you create something better. Discipline is often misunderstood because people associate it with intensity, strict routines, or extreme effort. In reality, it is much quieter than that. It shows up in small, repeated actions that don't feel important in the moment but become decisive over time. When life was difficult, when things felt unstable or uncertain, you didn't rely on motivation to get through it. You relied on simple actions you could control. You woke up when you needed to, even if you didn't feel like it. You handled responsibilities even when your mind was distracted. You kept moving forward in small steps, not because you were inspired, but because stopping would have made things worse. That is discipline in its most practical form. What's important to understand is that discipline doesn't appear suddenly in difficult moments. It reflects what you've been doing consistently before those moments arrive. When pressure increases, people don't rise to a new level of behavior. They fall back on their existing habits. If those habits are weak, inconsistent, or based on comfort, the response to pressure becomes unstable. But if those habits are structured, even at a basic level, they provide stability when everything else feels uncertain. Think about someone who has developed the habit of managing their time carefully. They don't wait until they are overwhelmed to start organizing their day. They already have a system for prioritizing tasks, setting boundaries, and avoiding unnecessary distractions. When a high-pressure situation appears, they don't panic as easily because they already know how to allocate their attention. On the other hand, someone who usually operates without structure, waking up late, reacting to tasks randomly, constantly switching focus, finds it much harder to cope when demands increase. The situation itself may be the same, but the outcome is different because of the underlying habits. Discipline also reduces the need for constant decision-making. When you have clear routines, you don't waste energy thinking about whether or not to do something. The decision has already been made in advance. This becomes especially important during stressful periods when your mental capacity is already limited. If every action requires effort and thought, you become exhausted quickly. But if certain behaviors are automatic, you preserve energy for the things that actually require attention. There is also a strong connection between discipline and emotional control. When things go wrong, the natural response is to react: frustration, doubt, impatience. These reactions are normal, but if they guide your actions, they create instability. Discipline acts as a counterbalance. It allows you to continue doing what needs to be done regardless of how you feel in that moment. This doesn't mean ignoring emotions, but it does mean not letting them dictate your behavior. Over time, this creates consistency, and consistency creates results. Real-life patterns make this clear. Someone trying to improve their physical health may start with strong motivation. They go to the gym regularly, adjust their diet, and feel progress early on. But motivation fades. It always does. At that point, discipline becomes the deciding factor. If they continue showing up, even without excitement, they maintain progress. If they stop because they no longer feel motivated, they lose momentum and eventually return to their previous state. The difference is not knowledge or ability, but consistency. The same applies to learning and skill development. In the beginning, there is curiosity and interest, but mastery requires repetition, and repetition is rarely exciting. It's structured, sometimes boring, often slow. People who rely on motivation struggle to maintain that level of effort. They start strong, but fade quickly. People who rely on discipline accept the repetitive nature of improvement and continue anyway. Over time, that difference becomes significant. One group remains at a basic level, while the other gradually builds competence and confidence. Discipline also creates predictability in your life. When your actions are consistent, your results become more stable. This doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but it reduces unnecessary variability. You know that certain outcomes are likely because your behavior supports them. This reduces stress because you are not constantly reacting to unexpected consequences of inconsistent actions. Instead, you are guiding your own direction through steady effort. There's also a long-term advantage that often goes unnoticed. Discipline compounds. Small actions repeated daily accumulate into larger results over time. This process is slow and often invisible in the beginning, which is why many people underestimate it. They look for immediate changes and become discouraged when they don't see them. But the impact of discipline is not immediate. It's gradual. The person who reads a little every day, practices a skill regularly, or manages their time consistently may not see dramatic changes in a week or a month. But over a year, the difference becomes clear. Over several years, it becomes difficult to ignore. On the other hand, the absence of discipline also compounds, but in a negative direction. Small acts of neglect, skipping responsibilities, avoiding effort, choosing comfort repeatedly build over time into larger problems. At first, the impact seems minor. Nothing serious happens immediately, but gradually those choices create gaps in knowledge, missed opportunities, and increasing pressure. By the time the consequences become visible, they are much harder to manage. Another important aspect is that discipline builds trust in yourself. When you consistently follow through on what you say you will do, even in small ways, you create a sense of reliability. You stop doubting your ability to handle challenges because you have evidence from your own behavior. This kind of confidence is different from external validation. It doesn't depend on recognition or results alone. It comes from knowing that you can rely on your own actions regardless of circumstances. This internal trust becomes critical during difficult times. When things are uncertain, when outcomes are unclear, you don't have to rely on hope alone. You rely on your habits. You trust that if you continue doing the right things, the situation will improve over time. This doesn't guarantee immediate success, but it provides stability and direction. It's also worth noting that discipline is not about perfection. It doesn't require you to execute every action flawlessly or maintain consistency without interruption. There will be mistakes, missed days, and moments of inconsistency. What matters is the ability to return to your structure without losing direction. People who succeed with discipline are not the ones who never fail, but the ones who don't allow failure to break their pattern entirely. Over time, discipline becomes less of a forced effort and more of a default way of operating. Actions that once required effort become automatic. Decisions that once felt difficult become straightforward. This reduces resistance and makes it easier to maintain consistency. The initial phase requires conscious effort, but the long-term result is efficiency. When you look back at the moments where you managed to keep going despite difficulty, you'll notice that discipline was present in some form. It may not have been perfect or structured, but it was enough to prevent collapse. That same principle, when developed intentionally, becomes a tool not just for survival, but for progress. One of the most difficult parts of growth is realizing that not everyone who started with you was meant to continue with you. At the beginning of any journey, whether it's personal development, career progress, or a shift in mindset, people are often surrounded by familiar faces. These are the people who knew you when your habits were different, when your standards were lower or less defined, when your priorities were more aligned with comfort than direction. There is a sense of stability in that familiarity, and for a while, it feels like those connections will naturally evolve as you do. But in reality, growth is not always shared, and when it isn't, distance becomes inevitable. This distance doesn't always happen through conflict or a clear ending. In many cases, it happens quietly. Conversations become less engaging, interests no longer align. What once felt natural starts to feel forced. You may notice that the topics you care about, discipline, long-term goals, improvement, are not met with the same level of interest. At the same time, the things that used to hold your attention, distractions, gossip, short-term excitement, no longer feel satisfying. This shift creates a gap, and that gap grows over time. The reason for this is simple but often ignored. Relationships are built on shared values and behaviors. When those values change on one side but remain the same on the other, the foundation of the relationship weakens. It's not about one person being right and the other being wrong. It's about alignment. If you are moving toward structure, focus, and long-term thinking, as someone else is comfortable with inconsistency, avoidance, or short-term habits, the interaction becomes strained. Neither perspective feels fully understood by the other. This is where many people make a critical mistake. Instead of accepting the shift, they try to maintain the relationship in its original form. They adjust themselves to fit back into old patterns, even when those patterns no longer serve them. They participate in conversations that no longer interest them, tolerate behaviors they've outgrown, and lower their standards to preserve familiarity. In the short term, this avoids discomfort, but in the long term, it creates internal conflict. You start to feel disconnected from your own direction, not because you don't know what you want, but because your environment is pulling you in a different direction. The cause and effect here is clear. When you consistently place yourself in environments that don't support your growth, your progress slows down, your focus weakens, your discipline becomes inconsistent. Not because you've lost your ability, but because your surroundings influence your behavior more than you realize. Over time, this can lead to frustration because you know you're capable of more, but your actions don't reflect it. On the other hand, when you accept that not everyone will continue with you, you create space for alignment. This doesn't mean cutting people off abruptly or treating them with disrespect. It means recognizing where you stand and adjusting your level of involvement accordingly. Some relationships naturally become less central. Others may remain, but in a different capacity. The key is honesty, understanding what supports your growth and what doesn't. Real-life situations make this even clearer. Consider someone who decides to take their goals seriously for the first time. They start managing their time better, reducing distractions, and focusing on skill development. At first, their social circle may not react strongly, but as the changes become consistent, reactions start to appear. Some people may question the change, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. Others may feel uncomfortable because your discipline highlights their lack of it. This can lead to subtle pressure suggestions to relax more, to not take things too seriously, to return to old habits. If you give in to that pressure repeatedly, your progress slows. You begin to compromise your standards to maintain approval. Over time, this leads to a situation where you are no longer moving forward, but you're also not fully comfortable staying where you are. That's the cost of trying to maintain alignment where it no longer exists. There's also an emotional aspect to this process that shouldn't be ignored. Letting go of certain connections, even gradually, can feel like loss. There may be shared history, memories, and a sense of loyalty that makes it difficult to accept the change. But it's important to separate history from direction. Just because someone was part of your past doesn't automatically mean they fit into your future. Holding on to that assumption can limit your ability to grow. At the same time, growth doesn't mean isolation. As you become more focused and intentional, you naturally start to encounter people who operate in a similar way. These connections may not form as quickly or as easily, but they tend to be more stable because they are based on shared values rather than convenience. Conversations become more meaningful. Expectations are clearer. There is less need to explain your choices because they are understood. The transition between these phases, moving from familiar but misaligned relationships to fewer but more aligned ones, requires patience. There may be periods where your circle feels smaller, where interactions are less frequent, where things feel quieter than before. This is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a natural part of adjusting to a different standard. Another important factor is that growth can sometimes expose uncomfortable truths about how certain relationships function in the past. You may realize that some connections were based more on convenience, shared habits, or mutual avoidance of responsibility than on genuine support or understanding. This realization can be difficult, but it also provides clarity. It helps you make better decisions moving forward, not just about who you spend time with, but about the kind of relationships you want to build. The long-term effect of accepting this principle is significant. When your environment aligns with your goals, your actions become more consistent. You spend less energy resisting negative influence and more energy focusing on progress. Your standards remain intact because they are supported, not challenged by the people around you. This creates a feedback loop where growth becomes more sustainable. It's also important to understand that this process is ongoing. As you continue to evolve, your standards may change again, and your circle may adjust with it. This is not instability, it's progression. The goal is not to maintain the same relationships indefinitely, but to maintain alignment between your environment and your direction. In practical terms, this means being selective with your time, aware of your influences, and honest about your priorities. It means recognizing when a situation is pulling you backward instead of pushing you forward. And it means having a discipline to choose long-term growth over short-term comfort, even when that choice feels uncomfortable at first. When you look at it logically, this is not about losing people. It's about refining your environment to match the person you are becoming. And that refinement is necessary if you want your actions, habits, and results to stay consistent with your long-term vision. Most people spend a large part of their lives chasing comfort because it feels like the natural reward for effort. The assumption is simple. If you work hard, endure difficulty, and stay patient long enough, life should eventually become easy. Problems should reduce, pressure should fade, and you should reach a point where things finally feel smooth. But reality doesn't follow that pattern. What actually changes after a difficult phase is not the level of comfort you experience, but the level of clarity you gain. Clarity is not something people actively chase at first because it doesn't feel rewarding in the way comfort does. It doesn't provide immediate relief or pleasure. In fact, it often makes things harder in the short term because it forces you to see things as they are, not as you wish they were. It removes illusions, excuses, and emotional shortcuts. But once you have it, it becomes one of the most valuable assets you can develop because it directly improves the quality of your decisions. When you lack clarity, your decisions are often driven by emotion, habit, or external influence. You choose what feels good in the moment rather than what makes sense in the long term. You stay in situations longer than you should because you're attached to potential instead of reality. You delay important actions because discomfort feels unnecessary at the time. These choices may not seem significant individually, but they accumulate over time and create outcomes that feel confusing or disappointing. Once clarity develops, that pattern changes. You begin to recognize cause and effect more quickly. You see how small decisions lead to larger consequences. You notice when something doesn't align with your values or long-term direction, and you're less likely to ignore it. This doesn't mean you become perfect or that every decision becomes easy, but it does mean you operate with a higher level of awareness. For example, in relationships, clarity changes what you tolerate. Without it, you may focus on how someone makes you feel in the moment, overlooking inconsistencies or lack of effort. You might justify behavior that doesn't meet your standards because you're hoping it will improve over time. With clarity, you pay more attention to patterns than promises. You evaluate actions instead of words. If something feels off repeatedly, you address it earlier instead of waiting for it to become a bigger problem. The result is fewer prolonged situations that lead to unnecessary emotional strain. In work and personal development, clarity shifts your focus from short-term rewards to long-term value. Instead of chasing quick results or external validation, you begin to prioritize skills, consistency, and sustainable progress. You understand that meaningful improvement takes time, and you become more patient with that process. This reduces the tendency to jump between strategies or abandon efforts prematurely. You stay with what works, refine it, and allow it to develop. There is also a strong connection between clarity and responsibility. The more clearly you see your situation, the harder it becomes to blame external factors for your outcomes. You start to recognize your role in both your progress and your setbacks. This can feel uncomfortable at first because it removes the option of avoiding accountability, but it also gives you control. If your actions contribute to your results, then changing those actions can improve your situation. This shift is important because it moves you from a reactive mindset to a proactive one. Instead of waiting for circumstances to change, you focus on what you can adjust. This might be your habits, your environment, your approach to problems, or the way you manage your time. Over time, these adjustments create more stable and predictable results, not because life becomes easier, but because your approach becomes more effective. Clarity also changes how you view opportunities and risks. Without it, opportunities can look attractive simply because they promise quick rewards, and risks can be underestimated because the potential downside is not fully considered. With clarity, you evaluate both more carefully. You consider the long-term impact of your choices, not just the immediate benefit. This leads to more balanced decisions where you are willing to take calculated risks but avoid unnecessary ones. Another effect of clarity is that it reduces internal conflict. When you are uncertain about what you want or what matters to you, your actions often feel inconsistent. You may start something and then lose direction, or you may feel pulled in multiple directions at once. This creates stress and confusion. As clarity increases, your priorities become more defined. You know what you are working toward and why. This doesn't eliminate challenges, but it makes your actions more aligned, which reduces wasted effort. It's also important to understand that clarity doesn't remove difficulty. You will still face challenges, setbacks, and periods of uncertainty.